The city was a place of constant noise and grime. Elara shared a single small room with her two babies, William and Anna. Each day was a struggle. She worked until her fingers ached, mending clothes for a few coins, but it was never enough. The fear that she could not keep her children safe and fed was a cold stone in her stomach. She felt utterly alone in the world. One afternoon, while trying to quiet Anna's cries, she saw a newspaper someone had left behind. A page was open to a section called the Matrimonial Times. Her eyes scanned the small advertisements placed by men from the West seeking wives. One in particular made her breath catch. It was from a man named Silas, a rancher from Montana. He described his land as vast and his home as sturdy. He wanted an honest woman for companionship. A wild, desperate hope began to bloom in her chest. This could be their chance. She found an old photograph of herself from a time before the twins, when her eyes still held a light-hearted sparkle. She wrote a letter back to Silas, her hand trembling. She wrote of her strength and her willingness to work hard. She wrote of her good character. She did not write a word about William and Anna. It was a secret she clutched to her heart, a terrible gamble. She posted the letter and waited, her hope a fragile thing. Weeks later, a reply arrived. Silas had found her letter satisfactory. He enclosed money for a train ticket. Elara's hands shook as she held the paper. It was their ticket to a new life. She pushed the nagging voice of worry deep down. She would explain everything when she arrived. He would see her good heart and he would understand. She packed her one small trunk with their few possessions, her dreams painting a picture of a sunny ranch house where her children could run and grow strong. She was risking everything on the kindness of a stranger. The train ride west was long and sooty. William and Anna, unaccustomed to the constant jostling and noise, fussed in her arms. Elara spent most of the journey trying to soothe them, her own anxiety growing with every mile that carried her further from the familiar. She stared out at the changing landscape, watching the crowded cities give way to vast open plains. The sheer emptiness of it was both thrilling and terrifying. This was the freedom she had dreamed of, but it felt so immense and lonely. Finally, the conductor called out, "Bitterbrush." Her heart leapt into her throat. She gathered the twins, one on each hip, and stepped onto the wooden platform, squinting in the bright sunlight. The air smelled of dust and horses. And then she saw him. A tall man, lean and stern-looking, stood with a copy of the Matrimonial Times tucked under his arm. Silas. For a single heart-soaring moment, his eyes met hers, and she saw a flicker of approval. He was even more imposing than she had imagined. Then his gaze lowered. It dropped from her face to the child on her left hip, then to the one on her right. The approval vanished. His expression did not just become neutral. It became cold, hardening like stone. The air seemed to grow still. "Miss Finch," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of the warmth she had foolishly hoped for. "Yes," she replied, her own voice barely a whisper. "And these are my children, William and Anna." She forced the words out, her face flushing with a mixture of shame and fear. "Children," he repeated. The word was a verdict. He said nothing more. He did not offer to help with her trunk. He did not smile at the babies. He simply turned and said, "The wagon is this way." The journey to the ranch was completed in a heavy, suffocating silence. The twins, sensing the tension, stayed unusually quiet. Elara looked out at the beautiful, rolling land, but now it seemed like a beautiful prison. The hopeful dream she had nurtured on the train withered and died, replaced by a chilling certainty. She had made a terrible mistake. The first night under Silas Henderson's roof was the longest and loneliest of Elara's life. She was given a small plain room at the back of the house for herself and the twins. It was clean, which was more than she could say for her room in the city, but it was also cold and bare. There were no curtains on the window and the moonlight streamed in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. William and Anna, exhausted from the journey, finally fell into a fitful sleep in the center of the narrow bed, but Elara could not rest. She lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling and the distant howl of a coyote, each noise making her jump. She replayed the cold disappointment on Silas's face over and over in her mind, and a deep dread settled in her stomach. What would become of them now? She had no money for a return ticket, no home to return to even if she did. They were trapped. The next morning she rose before the sun, her body aching with fatigue. She dressed quietly and crept into the main room of the house, hoping to make herself useful before Silas awoke. The house was a mirror of the man himself. It was sturdy and well built, with solid furniture and a large stone fireplace. But there was no warmth in it, no personal touch. There were no pictures on the walls, no books left casually on a table, no comfortable chair by the hearth. It was a place for existing, not for living. She found the kitchen and started a fire in the stove, her movements slow and hesitant. She was just setting a pot of coffee to brew when she heard his footsteps. Silas entered the kitchen, dressed for work. He did not greet her. He simply looked at the coffee pot and gave a slight, curt nod. They ate a silent breakfast of oatmeal. Silas did not look at her or the children. He stared straight ahead at the wall, chewing his food methodically. The twins, sensing the tense atmosphere, were unusually quiet, spooning the mush into their mouths with wide eyes. When he was finished, he pushed his bowl away and finally spoke. His voice was not angry. It was worse than that. It was completely devoid of emotion, as if he were discussing the weather or the price of grain. "Miss Finch," he began, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above her head. "The situation is not what was agreed upon. You presented yourself as a woman alone, seeking marriage. You are not alone. This changes everything." Elara opened her mouth to explain, to apologize, to beg for understanding, but he held up a hand to stop her. "I will not send you back. That would be an unnecessary cruelty, and I am not a cruel man. But the arrangement we had is void. There will be no marriage." Elara's heart sank like a stone in a deep well. This was what she had feared. She looked down at her hands, twisted in her lap, waiting for him to tell them to leave anyway. But he continued, "You may stay. You will work. You will earn your keep and the keep of your children. You will cook, clean, tend the garden, and keep this house. You will be my housekeeper. This is a business proposition now. Do you understand?" What choice did she have? None, absolutely none. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "Yes, Mr. Henderson," she whispered. "I understand." And so a new and difficult routine began. Elara's days started in the dark and ended long after the sun had set. She cooked 3 meals a day. Heavy, simple food meant to fill the stomach of a working man. She scrubbed the floors until her knees were sore. She beat the dust out of the rugs. She washed endless piles of laundry in a big metal tub. She tended the small vegetable garden out back, all with one baby clinging to her skirts and the other playing in the dirt nearby. She was always working, always moving, always tired. Silas was true to his word. He was not cruel. He provided food and shelter, but he was a ghost in his own home. He spoke to her only to give instructions or to critique her work. "The salt pork is too salty. The bread is not rising enough. There is dust on the mantel." He never ever acknowledged the twins. If little William toddled into his path, Silas would simply step around him as if he were a piece of furniture. If Anna babbled at him, he would act as though he had heard nothing. His silence toward them was a wall high and impenetrable. The children learned quickly. They stopped trying to get his attention. They stayed close to their mother, their small world defined by the kitchen and the patch of yard outside it. Elara's hope, which had once been so bright, now felt like a distant memory. She was a servant in a quiet, lonely house. She would sometimes look out the window at the vast, beautiful Montana sky and feel a pang of sadness. This was to have been their fresh start, their new beginning. Instead, it felt like another kind of prison, one with cleaner air but walls just as solid. She loved her children fiercely, and their laughter was the only music in the silence. But she worried for their future. What kind of life was this for them? To be ignored? To be treated as a burden, to grow up in a house without warmth or kindness? She felt the weight of her decision every single day, and the fear that she had failed them was a constant, aching companion. The weeks turned into months, and a deep, weary rhythm settled over life at the ranch. Elara's world had shrunk to the size of the house and the yard. Her arms were always full, either with firewood, a laundry basket, or a child. The twins were growing, becoming more active and curious, which meant her work was constantly interrupted. She would be kneading bread dough and would have to stop to wipe a tear, or settle a disagreement over a cherished wooden block. The isolation was profound. Silas spoke only when necessary, and the only visitors were the occasional ranch hands who came to the door for instructions, casting curious but silent glances at the woman and children who had appeared in their boss's house. One afternoon, Silas needed a new part for a broken piece of harness. He handed Elara a list of supplies and a small pouch of coins. "The general store," he said simply, already turning back to his work. The trip into town was a rare event, and Elara felt a flicker of something almost like excitement. She hitched the old mare to the wagon, settling William and Anna on a blanket in the back amidst the sacks of grain they were to trade. The journey was slow, the sun warm on her face. For a little while she could pretend she was just a woman taking her children to town. Bitterbrush was not much more than a main street with a few wooden buildings. The general store was a fascinating place for the twins, who pointed at jars of candy and bolts of brightly colored cloth. Elara moved through her list methodically, enjoying the simple act of choosing supplies. She was comparing 2 bags of flour when she felt a change in the air. The light through the windows dimmed. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. Within minutes, the bright day had transformed into a gloomy twilight. The wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in the building's walls. Then the storm broke. Rain lashed against the windows in great sheets, and a tremendous crack of thunder shook the entire store. The noise was terrifying. William, who had been investigating a barrel of nails, immediately burst into loud, frightened tears. Anna, startled by her brother's fear and the awful noise, joined in. Elara rushed to them, gathering them both in her arms, trying to shush them over the roar of the storm. The shopkeeper, Mr. Gable, looked on with a sort of helpless annoyance. Flustered, Elara reached for the coin pouch to pay for her things and leave, but in her haste her fingers fumbled. The pouch slipped from her grasp, hitting the wooden floor with a dull clink and spilling its contents. Coins rolled in every direction, disappearing under shelves and barrels. A hot wave of humiliation washed over her. Her children were screaming. The storm was raging, and now she was on her hands and knees scrambling for money she could not afford to lose. It felt like the lowest moment possible, a perfect picture of her chaotic life. Just as tears of frustration began to prick her own eyes, a calm, deep voice cut through the chaos. "Allow me," she looked up. A man was kneeling nearby. He was not young, his hair touched with gray at the temples, and his face was kind. He did not look at her with pity or irritation. He simply began to help, his movements slow and steady as he gathered the scattered coins. When he had collected them all, he stood and placed the full pouch back into her hand. His calmness seemed to soothe her, and she managed a shaky, "Thank you." But he wasn't finished. He turned his attention to the crying children. He did not try to take them from her. Instead, he knelt again, putting himself at their level, and made a soft clicking sound with his tongue. Then he waggled his fingers in a silly little dance. Through their tears, William and Anna watched him, their cries reducing to hiccups. The man smiled and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, crudely carved wooden horse. He offered it to William, who stopped crying entirely, his small hand closing around the toy. "A 2-horse town," the man said, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he looked at Elara. "Good thing I brought the other." He produced a second, slightly smaller horse for Anna. The storm was forgotten. The twins were now completely captivated by the toys and the kind stranger. He introduced himself as Samuel Carter, a farmer who lived south of town. He spoke to her easily, asking the children's names and complimenting her on managing them so well in the storm. He did not ask why she was there or who she was with. He simply treated her with a respect and kindness she had not experienced since arriving in Montana. They talked until the rain slowed to a gentle patter. When it was time to go, he tipped his hat and wished her a good day. As Elara bundled the children back into the wagon, the twins clutching their new wooden horses tightly, she felt a strange sensation. For the first time in a very long time, she did not feel alone. The memory of his kindness was a small, warm light in the cold silence of her life. The memory of the storm and the kind stranger lingered with Elara like the scent of rain on dry earth. It was a small, warm spot in her heart that she revisited in the quiet moments while kneading bread or folding laundry. She did not expect to see him again, believing it to be a single moment of grace in her difficult life. But the following week, when Silas sent her into town for more supplies, she saw him. Samuel Carter was standing outside the blacksmith's shop, and as her wagon rolled down the main street, he looked up, caught her eye, and tipped his hat with a warm smile. It was not a grand gesture, but it made her feel seen, a feeling so foreign she almost did not recognize it. A pattern began to emerge. It seemed that every time Elara had reason to go to Bitterbrush, Samuel Carter had reason to be there as well. He would always find a way to amble over and say hello. His greetings were never forward or improper. He would first always speak to the children, who began to recognize him and would toddle toward him with happy chirps. He remembered their names and asked them about their wooden horses. He began bringing them small gifts, not store-bought candies but things from the land. A pretty smooth stone, a feather from a blue jay, a handful of wildflowers for each of them to hold. Once the children were happily occupied, he would talk to Elara. Their conversations were never long, but they were real. He asked her opinions on things, a concept so strange to her now that she often stumbled over her answers. He asked if she thought they were in for an early winter, based on the thickness of the wool on the sheep he had seen. He mentioned he was rereading a book about the stars and wondered if she ever looked at the constellations. He spoke of his late wife, Clara, not with a sadness that pushed people away, but with a fondness that invited her memory into the conversation. He told a funny story about how Clara once tried to knit him socks, but they ended up big enough for a horse. Elara found herself laughing, a real, genuine laugh that felt unfamiliar on her lips. She, in turn, began to open up, just a little. She told him she missed reading, and his eyes lit up as he offered to lend her a book from his small collection. She mentioned a recipe her mother used to make for apple cake, and he told her it was his favorite kind. They talked about the challenges of the land, the price of grain, the beauty of a sunset over the prairie. He never once asked her about her arrangement with Silas Henderson. He seemed to understand it was a painful subject, and his kindness was in not making her explain it. He treated her not as a servant or a mail-order bride who had made a mistake, but simply as Elara. These brief meetings became the highlight of her weeks. The dread she once felt about going into town was replaced by a faint, hopeful anticipation. She would find herself smoothing her hair or patting down her dress before she arrived, a habit she thought she had forgotten. The trip home felt different too. The silence of the wagon ride was no longer filled with worry, but with the echo of a friendly conversation and the sight of her children happily clutching their new treasures. Samuel's friendship was like a single steady candle lit in a very dark room. It did not erase the difficulties of her life at the ranch, but it cast a gentle light that made the shadows feel less deep and frightening. She was still a housekeeper in a cold house, but for a few minutes each week she was also a woman named Elara, having a conversation with a friend. The change in Elara did not go unnoticed. Silas Henderson was a man who prided himself on noticing details, a trait that served him well in business but poorly in matters of the heart. He began to observe a difference in his housekeeper on the days she returned from town. There was a lightness in her step that had not been there before. Sometimes he would even hear her humming a soft tune under her breath as she worked in the kitchen, a sound that was so foreign in his quiet house it almost startled him. He saw the way her eyes, which had been so downcast and weary, now occasionally held a distant, thoughtful look, and sometimes even a faint smile would touch her lips before she remembered herself, and it vanished. He also heard the talk. In a small town like Bitterbrush, gossip traveled faster than a prairie fire. Whispers reached him that Samuel Carter seemed to have a lot of business in town these days, always coinciding with the visits of a certain woman with 2 young twins. A strange and uncomfortable feeling began to churn in Silas's stomach. It was not jealousy, he told himself firmly. He felt no romantic claim over Elara. He had rejected that possibility himself. It was more a sense of irritation, a feeling that his orderly world was being disrupted. He had established a clear boundary, a business arrangement, and now someone was disrespecting that boundary by paying attention to what he had deemed unimportant. He watched Elara more closely, his stern gaze following her around the house. He saw the little carved toys the children played with, gifts that certainly did not come from him. He saw the wildflowers sometimes sitting in a jar of water on the kitchen windowsill. Each small sign of kindness from the outside world felt like a quiet criticism of his own coldness. One evening, the tension came to a head. Elara had just put the twins to bed and was washing the supper dishes when she heard the sound of a horse and wagon approaching. It was unusual for anyone to come calling so late. A moment later, there was a firm knock on the front door. Silas, reading by the fire, looked up, his expression suspicious. He answered the door himself, and there stood Samuel Carter, his hat in his hands. Samuel did not ask for Silas. His eyes went past him, seeking and finding Elara in the doorway to the kitchen. "Good evening," Samuel said, his voice calm but serious. "I've come to speak with Elara, if I may." Silas's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside with a curt nod, his presence a dark shadow in the room. Samuel walked in, his eyes full of compassion as he looked at Elara. He did not mince words. "Elara," he began, his voice gentle but firm. "This is no life for you, or for them." He gestured toward the room where the children slept. "You are a treasure, and those 2 children are blessings, not burdens. You deserve a home filled with laughter and respect. You deserve to be a wife, not a servant." He took a deep breath, and then he did something that made Elara's heart stop. He got down on one knee right there on Silas's rug, looking up at her with utter sincerity. "Come away with me, be my wife. Let me be a husband to you and a true father to William and Anna. I have love enough for all 3 of you. Please say you will." Tears filled Elara's eyes, spilling over onto her cheeks. This was the proposal she had once dreamed of receiving. It was offered not out of necessity, but out of genuine love and respect. Before she could answer, Silas's voice cut through the emotional silence like a whip. His pride, stung and furious, made him cruel. "You'd take another man's leavings, Carter?" he said, the words meant to belittle them both. Samuel rose to his feet slowly. He turned to face Silas, and for the first time, his gentle eyes held a steely resolve. He did not raise his voice. He simply stated the truth that Silas had been too blind to see. "No, Silas," he said, his voice calm but ringing with conviction. "I'm not. I am accepting the family you were too blind to see was a gift. I am not getting a housekeeper. I am gaining a wife and 2 children. It seems to me that I am getting the better end of the bargain by far." In that moment, Silas was utterly silenced, finally understanding the magnitude of what he had thrown away. The wedding of Samuel Carter and Elara Finch was a small and simple affair, held in the little white church at the end of Bitterbrush's main street. It was nothing like the lonely transaction Elara had once imagined for herself. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and the room felt full of warmth and happiness, even though there were only a handful of people present. Elara wore a simple but pretty blue dress, and she held a bouquet of wildflowers that William and Anna had helped to pick. Samuel stood proudly at the altar, and when Elara walked toward him, he beamed as if she were the most magnificent sight he had ever seen. True to his word, he held a twin on each hip throughout the entire ceremony, whispering silly things to make them giggle. He was not just marrying Elara. He was welcoming her children, and they accepted him with joyful trust. They moved to Samuel's farm, a place that was smaller than Silas's ranch, but infinitely warmer. From the very first day it was home. The house was soon filled with noise. The sound of children laughing and running from room to room. The sound of Samuel telling them stories by the fire. The sound of Elara's contented humming as she cooked meals for her family. Samuel was a wonderful father. He taught William the names of all the tools in the barn. He helped Anna plant her own little row of flowers in the garden. He carved them an entire menagerie of wooden animals. In the evenings, after the children were asleep, he and Elara would sit together and talk about their dreams for the future. Their hands intertwined. Elara's heart, which had felt so small and frozen for so long, seemed to grow larger every day, filled with a love she had almost stopped believing existed. She was not just a housekeeper. She was a partner, a wife, a beloved mother. They worked the land together, and though the work was hard, it was shared, and that made all the difference. The farm prospered, not just with crops and animals, but with happiness. Silas Henderson remained on his large, well-ordered ranch. His house was always quiet. His floors were always clean. His meals were always on time, prepared by a new, older housekeeper who did her job efficiently and left every evening. He had all the things he thought were important. He had success in order and solitude. He would sometimes see the Carter family in town, see the way Samuel looked at Elara, see the children running to him with excited stories. He understood then, in a deep and lonely way, that he had been offered a treasure and had called it a burden. He had measured a woman's worth and found her lacking, and in doing so he had found himself with nothing but dust and silence. He had his land, but he had no family to share it with, and he finally understood that a life without love was no life at all. And so, Elara, William, and Anna found their true home not in a grand house, but in the heart of a kind man. They built a life not on a business arrangement, but on a foundation of love, respect, and the simple joy of being together. They had their happy ending, and it was more beautiful than any advertisement could ever promise. The end.